Welcome to Castle Howard. My name is Christopher Ridgway. I am head curator here.
And I'm Kit Monkman. I'm an artist and filmmaker, and I've made a piece that's currently in the chapel here at Castle Howard called People We Love.
And on the back of that exhibition, Kit and I are taking a tour of the house, discussing some of the many pictures hanging on the walls here. These are examples of portraiture in this 300-year-old house in the heart of North Yorkshire, still home to the Howard family ever since it was begun in 1699. And we see portraits of family members, people from public life, but also a gamut of faces across a much wider span, including three-dimensional pieces such as sculpture from ancient Rome, which gives us an entirely different perspective on the face. And for us, what's so exciting working with Kit and People We Love is that we're moving from the world of, if you like, static representation of faces to a moving, animated representation, embracing new digital forms of capturing the face that sit alongside these more traditional methods.
And what I find so interesting about having People We Love in an environment like this is the juxtaposition between painting, which, to greater or lesser extent represents privilege and status and quite curated faces, and then trying to put this very modern set of portraits which are really about a community who have all volunteered to sit for the work and who are willing to be portrayed in really very vulnerable position. So these faces are not curated. These faces are looking out with a kind of an openness and an honesty that kind of sits very interestingly with the collection here.
So Kit, we're here at the grand staircase. At the beginning of any tour around the house, you immediately encounter a whole lot of full-length portraits, but I thought we might have a look at this one directly in front of us, and I wonder what your reactions to that might be.
I suppose one of my first thoughts would be how the three ladies, who I don't know who they are, but there's very little interaction between them. The only animate being that seems interested in what's actually going on in the painting is the little dog in the bottom left-hand corner. But they all stare out at us, kind of very full frontal face. And I suppose my first question to you would be, well, apart from who are they, would be, who was the audience? Because they're clearly portrayed for a very specific audience.
Well, it's very interesting what you say about them being slightly statuesque and that the only animated thing is the dog. And of course, I suppose for an artist, that's the real difficult bit because, well, they say never work with children and animals. So the dog is being made obligingly still, whereas it probably was very hard in real life. But to go back to the girls, these three girls are the daughters of Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, who was responsible for the building of Castle Howard. Mary, Anne and Elizabeth, and they were painted around 1711 by a Venetian artist called Antonio Pellegrini, who was responsible for decorating the house. And they're portrayed clearly as desirable heiresses, I think. They're in a cultured pose, and you're right, they're not really looking at each other. I mean, although one's playing the keyboards, one's holding a sheet of music. In fact, both are holding sheets of music, possibly their own compositions. But they're engaging with us, and I think the ideal viewer would have been a would-be suitor.
Yep.
Who would look at these girls and think, well, any of them will be very eligible. Now, this I think leads on to what I think is the odd thing about this, is that they look alike.
They do. They look very similar.
But they're not triplets. So there's 16, 15 and 12 is the age difference between them.
Oh wow. So you think that these are all idealized versions?
I think so. I think that take your pick, any one of these is a wealthy daughter of the man who built this sumptuous building. And
they've had the Instagram filter out.
yes, yeah. But that's doing its job in those terms on that day.
Absolutely.
And for us, the difficulty is to say, well, who is who? And we can't from the pictures. But when these girls grew up and they left home from the 1720s onwards, they wrote collectively between them over 200 letters to their father. I mean, their father, who's standing next to us here. And so from that, we can establish three very different characters, very different life stories. Two of them were widowed, remarried. One of them was a professional hypochondriac, all sorts of adventures. And you can understand three very, very distinct individuals.
The human face is used an awful lot to sell us things, often because the face is beautiful or handsome or whatever, but it's very targeted towards a message that's about convincing. But you know, even all of us personally, I mean, on Instagram, on Facebook, I mean, we project images of ourselves that are idealized. And I think, you know, there's always that desire to kind of project through the human face.
Kit, I've come into this room because I wanted to pose a question to you directly back to people we love, and that was about the age of the people you film, because they're all adults.
Yep.
Is there a reason for that?
It's quite hard, I think, to sit and stare at a picture of someone you love for 4.5 minutes, which is pretty much what we ask people to do, people we love. And I think unless there's a story behind that, it's very hard to really see any journey in the face that is looking out. So it's a kind of reciprocal, cyclical thing, I guess, that the story needs to be embedded for us to be able to read it. And you know, kids obviously have their stories, but they're formative by their very nature. Fortunately, the vast majority of kids don't really understand loss. And I think there's something about the vulnerability that we're trying to explore in people we love that is about loss, because love is ultimately about loss. I mean, life is ultimately about loss. And I think that the sophistication, if you like, of that understanding, what love entails, and the kind of the tragedy in a way that's implicit in the beauty, is probably asking too much of kids.
It's a strange set of questions to ask, but it's particularly in the context of this room and the two pictures I wanted to just point out to you. These are of Georgiana, who was our 6th Countess of Carlisle. And what's unique about this room is, first of all, it's called Lady Georgiana's bedroom, and not many bedrooms at Castlehat have a specific person's name attached to them. She also happens to be the daughter of Georgiana, famous Duchess of Devonshire from Chatsworth. So, you know, it comes from a very kind of colourful family background, and her mother was sort of, you know, perhaps the great star of the second half of the 18th century in society and so on. But we have two portraits here. One is of her as an infant, holding a rattle, virtually the same as the rattle that's suspended on the wall below her. At the same time in this room, we have over here Georgiana much, much later in life, painted in 1848, 1850, when she's had 12 of her own children herself. And so for me, what's interesting, these two faces, we'll come to character and life story later on, but these two faces bookend this room. And in between, on the walls all around us, are most of the children and their spouses that they married into. So this is a kind of complete sort of generational family tree as much as anything else for us here.
Absolutely.
And then you talk about loss, and I think that's very interesting, because there is another portrait of her, for example, in mourning when her mother has died, and she clearly, the mother was the lodestar of her universe. In time, obviously, her husband and her children were. But she battled with melancholy all through her life. And there's an acute sense of, if you like, personal loss, not necessarily triggered by death or bereavement or anything, but struggling to keep her spirits, if you like, alive throughout her life.
Yeah, well, there's that Shakespeare quote, which I'm probably going to mangle now, from I think from a fellow, about, you know, there are many events in the womb of time that are yet to be delivered, and this is this room, isn't it, in many ways, and that face. Having said all that, I mean, I think there's really something that fascinates me about this face in relation to the other portraits we've looked at here, which, as we talked about, you know, so much about a kind of curated vision and a kind of projection of power and status. And there is something just wonderfully innocent about this face that's staring directly out at you, and actually very much in the kind of people we love aspect that it's kind of, it's meeting your gaze. And you know, there's I don't see, maybe I'm being naive here, but all I see in that depiction is love. I mean, this is made by parents who want to project kind of their love for their daughter, and it's kind of refreshing, actually, you know, to see something so innocent. But as you say, also fascinating that it's bookended by a lady at the other end of her life, with so many intervening stories. Yeah.
So Kit, we've arrived in the Great Hall, we've come down the antique passage, we've come past Cato, Scipio, all of these antiquities assembled by the fourth Earl, the son of the man who built Castle Howard. So these are from his grand tour. And we just stopped almost at random at one, but perhaps the critical thing here is he's unknown.
He intrigues me in a number of ways, as they all do, in fact. I mean, I think something about the antiquity of all of these faces, one of the things they have in common, I think, for me is, and I suppose because they're life-size and that they're 360 degree, they're physical objects, the sort of sense of familiarity. I mean, you know, I'm not suggesting that I would necessarily have meet him in the pub tonight, but there's nothing surprising about the face in terms of its humanity. It's a face that I could well know. And I think one of the things that interests me, particularly about, in reference to people we love, is that, so I mean, let's take, we did an edition in Pittsburgh in the States, and I'm using that as an example because I think there, for a European eye, there's quite a clear specificity, if you like, around time and place because of the clothing and the kind of ornamentation, the way that people present themselves. You can kind of tell that this is North America in, you know, the early 21st century. But actually beyond all the accoutrements, the t-shirts and the facial kind of decoration, this sort of absolute humanity, simplicity of the human face, staring into the eyes, you know, it crosses boundaries, both in terms of, it's kind of universal. It's universal across time and space. So whether it's Pittsburgh or here, whether it's the 2nd century or whether it's now, you know, there is this essential quality of the human face that transcends all of that.
I think you're right, and quite a lot of our visitors sort of remark on, how modern that face looks. And I think that's because it's not overtly stylized in an antique way, and actually that hairstyle, that beard style, you could see anybody with that today. And actually, I think if you put him in, say, Victorian costume, he'd pass as a Victorian gent in all sorts of ways. So I think you're right that, I mean, I suppose that's interesting about, to me, is do we feel that the human face hasn't changed, or simply that our response to the human face has changed or stayed the same?
Well, I think the cultural pressures on the human face, if you like, I mean, have fundamentally changed, or they've certainly significantly changed. But I think the essence of humanity, the kind of the knowledge of our own destiny, the pain and love that we project because we know where we're going and we know where the people we love are going, I think that's pretty universal. I think that would be transmittable across centuries. The one thing that sculpture does, which is so extraordinary, which sadly people we love doesn't do, and no two-dimensional portrait does, is that, you know, we share embodied space, don't we? And so if I move, the perspective on him changes, and, you know, we are subject to the same lighting conditions, and there's just something extraordinary about the way that dissolves time.
Yes, and I think one of the things we like to do here, if we can, is to think about how to relight these figures.
Yeah.
So let's go back into the 18th century. They would have been seen after dark in candlelight.
Which is an animating force itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And even the ones that have kind of complicated togas and folds in their togas, those would kind of flicker with shadow.
Absolutely.
This you'd have with the beard, So I think there's something there about actually just altering the lighting technologies, which isn't, you're not going to have that with electric light. We put the switch on, it's bathed in unified light, whereas the candlelight is kind of dramatising that personality in that space. But the two-dimensionality is very, very revealing, but it's like whenever you see somebody face-on shot and then you see a profile shot, and quite often I think that can't be the same person because the physiognomy looks different, because of course it's all flattened like that, but it isn't here. You get the sense of the projection of the nose and that kind of bushy moustache.
Yeah, I mean, the more I look at it, the more he kind of feels presence. You know, you could absolutely, we could be going for a beer with him afterwards.
Well, why don't we ask him? So, Kit, I brought you to this painting because it is probably my favourite portrait in the collection. Briefly, why? Because when I came here many, many years ago and didn't know anything about the pictures on the walls, this just happened to be a picture that stopped me in my tracks. The face, the pose was arresting, and so I've kind of got to love it even more ever since. And I know bits about the background, and we might touch on that, but I don't know whether you share my kind of reaction.
Well, I think it's a portrait full of life. So absolutely, I can see what draws you to it. He's a man with attitude. He's clearly a bit of a player, and I like his performative display, if you like. He sort of brightens the mood. I mean, I suppose, again, just putting it in the context of people we love. What's interesting is that this I would say is kind of high performance. We're back into our Instagram territory here of how do I want the world to see me. This is a man who is clearly expressing his individuality, and I'm not in any way opposed to that. But at the same time, we do live in this culture which celebrates the individual, and that is a drive that I think in the most recent years of social media has become kind of amplified to a point where we really are beginning to worry about the way that our communities have become so tribal and so sort of defined by whether you wear a hat or not. I mean, I'm obviously I'm joking, but this sense of you're in my church or you're not in my church, you're in my group or you're not, and this sort of angry debate via Twitter that it feels that the kind of tribal elements of being human have become amplified to a point which is really kind of toxic. And I think going back to the faces and people we love, I think what it reminds me is that actually the kind of the primal tribal quality of being human is recognition of our shared humanity.
I mean, I think perhaps the other thing I should say about this portrait is this is, if you like, rampant individualism, because this is a self-portrait. So he is absorbed with himself, leave alone the technical difficulties of painting yourself and capturing yourself, and in that pose too. So I think there's something interesting about that. I think though that there's a sense in this portrait I read, and this may just be purely my subjective response. I think it's to do perhaps also, but this is a late 16th century painting, so the world is a different place. I think communality is more pronounced then. I mean, that you can have a stronger sense of who and where you belong to, because the world hasn't fractured into this sort of myriad voices that we have today in a kind of global kind of transmission all the time. So I think, to me, this is what I pick up in this, plus the fact that this is a painting that, unlike some of the other ones we've looked at, this has caught a movement. I mean, he's sideways onto us and he's turned his head. The arms are folded. It's like you've said, "Hi, who are you?" and he's just turned to say hello. And for me, the other thing, it sounds a bit corny, but I like the hat. And I think, what does the hat do to mediate your projection of yourself? Hats are not fashionable, and they were, say, in the middle of the 20th century. But do you have sitters in people we love who wear hats? And
yeah, we have had, absolutely, and we have, I think in a similar sense. I mean, you can see individuals who are projecting themselves into the world in a much more colourful, amplified way than others. I mean, it's broad church. But I think, again, what's interesting is in the act of kind of meditation, of thinking very deeply about somebody else. That the ability to maintain that projection. I mean, obviously you can maintain your hat, but maybe not quite the swagger that we have here.
But of course, the irony is his swagger has kept going for 300 years or more, whereas your Instagram moment kind of might disappear or be replaced. I think that's perhaps the other thing, is that to me, self-representation today is much more transient, because you have a multiplicity of means of kind of reproducing yourself. I mean, if you don't like your Instagram today, then you can do it tomorrow. Well, this guy's only kind of going to get painted once or maybe twice in his lifetime.
Yes, but I suppose then we're into a kind of conversation about privilege as well, aren't we? In that, you know, how many people in the late 16th century could find any means by which they could maintain their image?
Yeah. I mean, you had to be a somebody to be represented. If you're a nobody, inverted commas, then you're just a background figure in a group portrait or something like that. And you know what we don't have here, rather sadly, is which you won't find in many country houses, are those conversation pieces, interior scenes where you have the kind of polite family, and then you might have in the margins of the picture a couple of servants who are kind of sort of squeezed out of the frame. But here, I mean, I find this just, you know, it's an arresting pose. I think it's an arresting impact on people. So, okay, well, we'll go from the hat to something else, maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're in the turquoise drawing room now, which was redecorated about 20 years ago with a fresh hang of largely family portraits. So again, it's a three-dimensional family tree, late 18th, early 19th century. And we're stopping in front of little Lady Mary Howard now. She's the youngest daughter of Georgiana, whose bedroom we were in earlier, the mother who had 12 children. And this was painted in 1828 by the local artist from Lastingham, John Jackson. For me, again, I go beyond the portrait, because for me, a lot of these portraits they're beautiful works of art, but they become gateways to human stories.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the particularly kind of satisfying thing about this portrait is that in 1828, the year it's painted, you have this angelic creature on the canvas here. Her mother begins to keep a journal of Mary's behaviour. And the journal opens with, "I'm keeping a journal about Mary's behaviour because she is so disobedient, quarrelsome, she will not do her lessons, she will not go to bed when she's asked to." And to me that is a kind of an enormous discrepancy between the picture and what is going on behind the picture, as it were, in the kind of the family, in the heads of the family, and indeed in the heads of this kind of obviously truculent little girl who's been captured in a moment of perfection.
Yes.
So, you know, what have you got? Little angel or little monster?
Yeah. It's very interesting as well. Also, I'm struck by, we go back to the kind of many events in the womb of time, but I mean, this is probably one of the paintings that, you know, what we're sort of 20 or 30 years before the camera. So, you know, photography and portraiture are about to revolutionise the way that these sorts of paintings exist and how they operate. And I think I'm kind of fascinated, particularly now that we're all on the cusp of a world full of AI and whatever, how artists respond to technology and the kind of the ways in which technologies change painting. So I mean, this is, as you said, I mean, it's an extraordinary and very poignant painting. But if it were painted 40 years later, it would be read in a very different light, and I think it would fall far more into the sentimental category than it did.
And 40 years later, we do have photographs of her. So she's that generation that moves into the camera age.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me to another point, which is something that's possible to judge from a portrait alone, which is likeness. I mean, how true to the likeness is it? I mean, you're right, you'll focus on, as it were, that common humanity and that sort of thing. But in a sense, you've been coming from that in this discussion. I've been coming from the individualistic side, and therefore, is this like the person? Would she look at that and say, yes, that's me? Or as we know, that famous example when Churchill saw the Sutherland painting of him, he was kind of so appalled that in the end his wife kind of had it burnt. So here, I'm always interested in that individuality and you moving into the camera age, which is supposedly more reliable.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to argue against that individuality. It's just that People We Love as a piece is really about, I think, the vulnerability that exists below all of our curated selves. And so I think, what we've talked about today and the pictures we've looked at fascinate me, and I refer back to the gentleman in the cocked hat, or the jaunty hat. So the individualism of the paintings absolutely fascinates me. I think there's just this kind of extraordinary tension between curated imagery and the sort of the vulnerable human.
Kit, we're in the Long Gallery, obviously this lengthy display space dominated largely by portraits. And I've stopped at this one. I mean, let's face it, I could have stopped at dozens of other ones. But I'm intrigued by this one and perhaps your reaction to it, because this is unusual for what we've looked at, is there's a dynamic in the picture between two individuals. So it's a double portrait. And it's a moment of exchange or communication or whatever between an older man and a younger man.
It's fascinating. I suppose my first reaction, certainly in relation to People We Love, is that actually there's a minimum of 4 people involved in this portrait, aren't there? There's the artist, there's the 2 people in the frame, and then there's the viewer. And so you've got this quite complicated transaction going on between us and our imaginations trying to project into the story that's going on here, all filtered through the skill of an artist. I suppose in relation to People We Love, what interests me is that People We Love really is just a transaction between 2. I mean, as an artist, the artist has almost disappeared from that transaction, and that desire for an audience to leap into an imaginative space, or the invitation to move into an imaginative space, is held between 2 people. Whereas here, it's a much more complex dynamic, but a fascinating hint at a story, which I'm sure you're going to be able to explain.
Well, there is a story, and it's a real historical moment. And I think before I say a little bit more about that, I'm interested too in the sight lines in that picture. That you have the older man is clearly looking at the sun. The son's head is sort of turned towards the father, but not actually fully engaged in it. And yet those eyes are kind of slanted to the left very much. So there's a kind of poise in that, which I think is quite interesting. This is a painting known as Clouded Majesty. It's a version after the famous version by Sir Peter Lely, and it depicts Charles I and his son James during the Civil War, at the moment of captivity. Clouded Majesty, we know the 1640s was not a good decade for majesty, for monarchy. And it's said to represent this moment where father and son are passing some sort of message between them. He's holding a piece of paper, he's reaching out for what looks like a pen or a stylus or something. People have speculated that it's a secret message, but actually you can read the inscription on the paper anyway, so there's nothing secret about it. It's not a code or something like that. But for me, if we take that back to some of the other things we've talked about, is we have the privilege here of rolling time forward and knowing that one man's going to lose his head and another man's going to go into exile and then come back and take the throne. So there's a whole set of kind of historical dynamics that are about to be played out.
That's fascinating. So how contemporary with the moment is this painting?
Reasonably so. I mean, still 17th century. So yeah.
Okay, but after those,
yeah.
so the artist knew what was unfolding,
Pretty
what
much
had
so.
unfolded.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
So for me, this is kind of rather unique in that, and again, looking at the accoutrements to it. So the son actually is far more grandly dressed. I mean, this is partly because his father is deeply in shadow.
Well, I was going to say he's inhabiting quite a dark space,
Yes.
isn't he? Which is clearly, I suppose.
There's all kind of iconographies coming into play there, and we've resisted the iconography word so far, and rightly so, because I think we get back to a sort of a deeply curated view of things. But because this is clearly meant to represent a poignant moment of exchange in a family, it's whether it kind of really reveals that, or how much you have to know the story to build that reaction up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point. I think, had I not had the background, I think it's quite a hard painting to read, I would have thought, because there's something quite ambiguous in this transaction. But in context, it becomes sort of tantalising.
It does, and I think it probably, there's the other point I kind of like to make about it is we've talked about how sitters are posed and they are projecting a moment, a persona.
Yeah.
In a way, this is magnified even more because this is royalty, and royalty kind of have another layer of persona or regal persona that behind them as well.
Yes.
They are an institution as well as a person.
Yes, and I assume as well, given when this was painted, it's a fiction, isn't it? It's a recreation.
Yeah.
So these are not people who sat for the painting; they are being sort of brought back into a moment of time.
Yeah. We're here in the chapel, Kit. People we love. This is your installation. Tell me more.
Well, I think maybe I should start with how this gets made. And what we do is we put out a general call to people local to Castle Howard in this instance. And all they're requested to do to answer that call is turn up to be filmed, bringing with them a picture of someone they love or loved. It's a singular person, so there's already a kind of act of decision making on the part of the sitter in terms of how they make that decision, who they choose. But once they've done that, they are just put in a little dark room. We actually filmed it here in the house. And the picture of the person they love, who nobody else sees, it's entirely private. It's very important that nobody knows who it is they're looking at. But they put the picture down beside them, and then that kind of gets relayed to what is essentially an auto cue. So they're looking at the camera, but all they see is the image of the person they love. And it really is as simple as that. They're filmed for 4 or 5 minutes looking into the eyes of someone they love. So when you then turn up here in the chapel, and we did look at various spaces around the house where we might have put this, and it's not a religious piece in my mind at all, but it certainly works, I think, beautifully here because it's such a contemplative space. I mean, such a beautiful space, but it's also a space in which, sitting and spending time feels like one's invited. And this is, in many senses, this is slow art. I think you could walk in and you could immediately look at these array of faces. There are 5 at any one time. And you could go, I understand what it is. It's people look at people we love. And you'd be right. But it's actually only when you step forward and stand in place of the person who they are looking at, these subjects are looking at, and you meet the gaze at eye level, that you really begin to examine these faces and the journey they're going on. And I think that's the point at which, these, as I say, totally uncurated faces, not only in the sense that they're uncurated in that there's no artifice, but they're uncurated by me too. Everybody who sat for it is included. So these aren't a chosen group of faces. These are just people, but these are people. And they are all, I would maintain, equally fascinating. When you get up close and you look into these eyes and you begin to wonder what the story is behind the reactions that you see, I think it draws you, well, certainly draws me into a very close sense of common humanity. I feel profoundly moved by these faces.
You know, you couldn't go and stand in front of somebody in real life for that 4 minutes without them saying, excuse me, you're invading my space, Absolutely. My privacy. So I think there's a kind of openness about their realization that there's going to be a huge audience that comes to look at them in ways that perhaps they were not used to if in real life. So I think that's for me is one of the really kind of intriguing things here. The different faces, some of whom I recognize, the different range of reactions, but the fact that you stop, you kind of turn off time, and you follow the kind of physiognomy through its kind of series of registers for what it's looking at. And I think, I haven't told you this, but one of the most interesting things that's come out of this anecdotally is that Douglas, our chaplain, who visits the chapel every week to collect the prayers that are left by the public. There's a box where they put prayers in, and he will collect them and then he will read them out. He has said that the volume of prayers has gone up since the installation of this People We Love.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think, well, two things I want to say. I mean, first of all, to express my really very sincere gratitude to people who sit, because I think it is an extraordinary act of generosity to kind of allow people to see oneself in this kind of, moment of really kind of honest, I go back to the word vulnerability, but honesty. But also I think, that we are living very much in a culture of immediacy and to some extent superficiality. We've never had a more media-rich landscape, but it's very much a kind of, I need my attention to be grabbed within minutes or seconds, and then I will flitter off to something else. This really is a space that invites, as I say, invites time and contemplation, and that's what this work needs. I would defy anyone to spend half an hour with these faces and not actually feel really quite different. I mean, so when I edit them, insofar as I do, which is only just kind of putting a very slight colour grade on the images to sort of bring out the portrait quality, I find that when I spend an hour or two with these faces and then go and buy a sandwich, kind of not thinking about it, and the faces that I see walking towards me on my way to the sandwich shop, I kind of suddenly, I read them fundamentally differently. I'm kind of drawn into these faces and the stories behind them, and sort of sense of shared humanity that I kind of feel is really important for all of us at the moment.
I mean, this is the antithesis of surveillance society, isn't it? I mean, everything is about instant recognition, instant detection, instant visuality, move on, move on, move on, whether it's kind of an authoritarian eye or a kind of commercial eye or anything like this. I mean, this is the antithesis to that, which I think is deeply kind of refreshing as a way of looking.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, in a world where we kind of fetishize the artist in terms of value, and I think what interests me as well is that if somebody turns up here and has a really meaningful exchange with one of these portraits, it's very likely that I never met the sitter and I don't know the person who's having that experience. So where does the kind of aesthetic value in that transaction lie? It doesn't lie with me. It lies in these faces and in the faces and the imaginations that look on them. So it's a kind of transaction of imagination between these sitters and the people who stand in for the people they love. And I think there's something about that kind of appeals to me in terms of the audience as creative agent.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation around the paintings here at Castle Howard, and we hope you've enjoyed it. And my thanks to Kit for joining me in this conversation.
It's been such a great pleasure to be shown around the collection here by you, Chris, and it's really made me think, very hard really about people we love and its relationship to all the paintings here. I hope you've enjoyed it too.